Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Patrick Buck, a Ph.D. candidate at Michigan State University, to talk about the ideological underpinnings of two political movements, one that took place in China and one that took place in Taiwan. Patrick, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you talk about, in your thesis, this comparison between China and Taiwan. Particularly, you talk about this phenomenon called the Criticize Lin Biao and Criticize Confucius Campaign, and you compare and contrast it with the Chinese Cultural Renaissance Campaign, which was taking place in Taiwan. And by the way, the Criticize Lin Biao, Criticize Confucius Campaign being in mainland China. First of all, can you give us some historical context to what these two phenomena were, and then tell us how this fits into your dissertation?
Yes. So you're right, two different campaigns happening at the same time in these two political regions of China during the Cold War. So the Criticize Lin Biao, Criticize Confucius Campaign, or P.L.P. calling it shorter in Chinese, was really the last major campaign that the PRC launched before the death of Mao Zedong. And basically, so it's the sort of last major hurrah of the Cultural Revolution decade, which began in the summer of 1966. And the P.L.P. campaign was launched in late 1973 in the context of the 10th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. And this was the Congress that was held, so the 9th Congress was in 69, and that's called the Cultural Revolution Congress, or conference, where they affirmed the Cultural Revolution was a success, and they declared that Lin Biao, who was then the Minister of Defense, would be Mao Zedong's successor. But 2 years later, Lin Biao died under still kind of murky circumstances. But after his death, he was, believed and claimed by the state to be a traitor who was in a conspiracy with his son, who was in the Air Force, to try to assassinate Mao, and so that the Lin family could take over. And we don't really know all the details still to this day about all of this, but that's the official line. And so when they held the 10th Party Congress, they had to address that the chosen successor was gone. And so the 10th Party Congress, they said, we're going to have a campaign that's aimed at criticizing Lin Biao, but they also added this criticism of Confucius at the same time, because in the posthumous investigation of Lin's family compound, his house, the official news came out that he had these quotations from Confucius and from Confucian texts hidden in his house. And so the official line was that he was like a secret Confucian, which made him a conservative and like a reactionary and not a true revolutionary. And so that's why they lumped these two together. And that campaign kind of finishes off the end of the Cultural Revolution decade. And as far as the Cultural Renaissance Campaign in Taiwan, under the Republic of China, the ROC, that was launched in the same year that the Cultural Revolution was launched, a few months later. And one explanation of the beginning of it is that it was the 100th birthday celebration of Sun Yat-sen, the first president of the ROC. but it was also a response to the Cultural Revolution on the mainland, because it's the same year, a few months later. And the Cultural Renaissance campaign is basically a reaction to what they viewed in the mainland, where they thought that the Cultural Revolution was about destroying traditional Chinese culture and destroying traditional Chinese values. So this Cultural Renaissance campaign would make Taiwanese people identify as Chinese and identify with this chosen view of traditional Chinese culture, which was basically kind of orthodox Neo-Confucianism mixed with the nationalist ideology of the Chinese Nationalist Party that was controlling Taiwan under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek at the time. And so I'm looking at these two campaigns, these two parallel campaigns happening at the same time.
And can you talk a little bit about the significance of these two movements for the purposes of your research? What statement are you trying to make based off of these comparisons?
Good question. Initially, I was interested in the Criticize Confucius campaign because I was interested in how the Chinese classics, so classical Chinese philosophy, played a part in modern Chinese ideology and political thought. And I quickly discovered that in his speeches and his writings, Mao Zedong expressed admiration for the legalists, a school of ancient Chinese philosophy that was critical of Confucianism. And so I then, when it came time to pick a sort of dissertation topic, I realized that this was a good way for me to analyze that larger question of the kind of relationship between tradition and modernity, or between the influence of antiquity on modern thought, was through this campaign, because this was a modern campaign that was focused heavily on talking about antiquity and about the classics. And it really hadn't been written much about in recent years. And so it became a feasible topic. And then the Taiwan element came a little bit later, when I kind of unexpectedly in the archives stumbled across propaganda materials created by the Republic of China based in Taiwan, where they were criticizing this Criticize Confucius campaign in the mainland. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. I never thought about, like, yeah, they must have had some response to this. And I realized that there was this whole massive government campaign that was in many ways kind of similar to each other. Both sides were mass producing history books and new annotated translations of classical texts, and scholars were recruited to participate in these campaigns, and sort of textbooks were written and created for public education. This would just seemed like, wow, a perfect analogous comparison. And as far as the Cultural Renaissance campaign, there's very little written about it in Chinese, let alone in English. There's practically no scholarship on it to this day, and that is interesting, because there's so much that's been written and is known about the Cultural Revolution, but there's not much known about this parallel thing that's going on. And it's kind of like revolution and Renaissance. It's like, the European Italian Renaissance and the French Revolution is kind of these two, like, ways of modernity kind of contesting with each other, but played out in a very different place and context.
So people who regularly listen to my podcast will know how I talk a lot about history as being this political tool. Can you talk about, just from your experience doing this research, why history was so important to these movements and how history was politicized. If you could go into some details about that.
Um, History is politicized in these movements. Well, um, as other scholars have noted, all of Chinese history was re-examined and rewritten in the earlier part of the 20th century, basically as a part of the May 4th movement, where modern and foreign ideas came in, and Chinese intellectuals began to re-examine their past, and that the legacy of that is kind of carried on by both the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Nationalist Party during the Cold War, but they constructed two different kinds of narratives that had similarities and differences between them. So, communist historiography after 1949, Chinese history was rewritten to fit into the Marxist-Leninist teleology, where societies move along in these stages called modes of production. You begin with primitive tribalism, and then it becomes a slave society, and then a feudal society, and then capitalism and socialism and communism. And so they tried to fit these labels onto Chinese history, and they had to figure out, okay, when did slavery end and feudalism begin in China? And there were debates between Chinese scholars about how to categorize that. And that is part of where this whole fascination with Confucianism and legalism came out of, because the communist historiography, the general consensus became by the 60s that Confucianism was reactionary and was the ideology of the slave-owning aristocrats, whereas legalism was progressive, and it was the ideology of the feudal land-owning class that would replace the Confucians. And also in the communist historiography, they wanted to emphasize peasant rebellions and the leaders of peasant rebellions as these like proto-revolutionaries and as models for Chinese people to look up to, who had previously been viewed in Chinese historiography as just like usurpers and bandits and illegitimate, whereas now the people would be lifted up as like the masters and the heroes of history. And the nationalists, on the other hand, particularly after 1949, when they went to Taiwan, they had to legitimize their regime in the eyes of the Taiwanese people, because the mainlanders were a minority, a small minority compared to the already living population in Taiwan. And so they constructed a narrative of Chinese history in which they emphasized this central kingdom, this Zhonghua, central civilization that is 5,000 years long, this continuous tradition that is passed on from the ancient sage kings Yao Shun and Yu to the Zhou dynasty kings and the Duke of Zhou, and then on to Confucius and his student, his successor Mencius, and it's kind of carried on through this tradition of legitimacy, of legitimate rule. So there's always like one legitimate dynasty that rules all of China and unifies all of China. And that fit into how the Nationalist Party wanted to perceive of itself, because it wanted to say that it was the legitimate inheritor of that tradition, of that Chinese civilization, and that the communists were just like, they called them, during the Cold War, the nationalists in Taiwan, they called the communists bandits. They specifically called them bandits, the same term that official Qing dynasty historians would call the Taiping Rebellion. They would call these peasant rebellions bandits. So they were like illegitimate usurpers who were trying to take away power from the people who really deserved it. And so that fit into how the Nationalist Party wanted to project itself, and this to legitimize its control over Taiwan during the Cold War period. So both sides are utilizing history. That's the kind of the great thing about the classics anywhere in the world, whether they be the Western classics or Chinese classics, is that as time goes on, they can kind of become whatever you want them to be. If you want to say Confucius was a revolutionary, you can make that argument. If you want to say he was a liberal or a progressive reformer or a reactionary of the worst kind, you can kind of like make him out to be however you want, because quotes can be taken out of context, and it was so long ago that we don't know all the details exactly, and so they can be kind of manipulated and used in different ways to advance different political ideologies.
I guess this question would have been better to ask a little bit earlier, but I did want to ask you a couple of questions about how Confucianism and legalism factor specifically into both these political movements. But for those who don't really have that great a familiarity with Chinese history, can you give us just like a brief explanation as to what is Confucianism, what is legalism?
Yes. Confucianism, named after Confucius, was a philosopher who lived in the 5th century BC during the Zhou dynasty, and his death marks the end of a period called the Spring and Autumn and the beginning of an era called the Warring States period. And Confucius essentially believed that the best times ever had already happened, and that he was living in an era of decline, and that rulers and officials and intellectuals in China should try to imitate the way that was perfected by the ancient sage kings and bring that into the current day to fix the chaotic situation that they were in at the time, which was basically that there was this Zhou dynasty, but it had these fiefdoms with different kings who were all fighting each other, and so China was chaotic and divided into different kingdoms. And after Confucius's death, there was kind of an explosion of philosophical debate and intrigue all over China. And so in Chinese, they call it the 100 schools of thought. There's all these different schools of philosophy debating with each other. Basically, officials and kind of educated aristocratic people were going around to different kingdoms, talking to different kings to try to convince them to adopt their philosophy. So Confucianism was one of those philosophies, and there are others. And another big one that ended up being very influential was legalism. And so Confucianism suggested that kings or a ruler should be benevolent towards his people, and emphasizes a system of ethics that is all about the relationships between people and about superiors being benevolent to their subordinates, and following this like ancient way. Whereas legalism was very different. Legalist philosophers famously said that there is no point in following the past. You should just do what makes sense right now. And they were all essentially bureaucrats who wanted to come up with a very systematic system of bureaucracy, and they're called the legalists because they emphasized law, and they said that law should be applied universally to everyone in society, so get rid of like aristocratic titles. But they also said that the ruler should be kind of like supremely above everyone else, and the ruler makes all of these laws, and then he just has his officials carry them out. And Confucians thought that legalism was was terrible because it was so immoral. It had no morality. You could just make any law that you wanted it to be, and ultimately they thought that laws and punishments would not make people do the right thing because they would just be afraid of being punished and they wouldn't think to do what is ethical. Whereas the legalists thought that Confucians were kind of, they're all talk and they're old fashioned and they just say nice flowery things, but they can't bring you real results. And well, famously, in the end, the first emperor of China, who unified all the warring states, adopted legalism. He was influenced by his advisors who were educated in legalist thinking, and that ultimately ended up being the means by which he could defeat all of his enemies, create a powerful army, and a strong bureaucracy to rule an empire. But also famously, that dynasty lasted very shortly, and it was replaced by the Han Dynasty. In the Han Dynasty, the emperors kind of took an eclectic approach where they had Confucian officials and legalist officials and Taoists all kind of advising them, and they used at different points in time these different methods and ideas from these different philosophies. And legalism was kind of forgotten for most of Chinese history because Confucianism became the official ideology or the official philosophy that all future Chinese dynasties and their officials had to be educated in. So it was only at the end of the Qing dynasty, when China was in a period of disunity again and fear of being conquered by foreign powers, that Chinese intellectuals started to look at legalism with a fresh eye and think, maybe this is something in our tradition that we could use to strengthen ourselves and to kick out these foreigners. And so some thinkers started to think that there were good things about legalism. And that's the kind of context in which, in the 1960s and 70s, they were talking about Confucianism and legalism as these two opposing ideologies.
This kind of factors into one last question I had before we wrap up, which is, did legalism play an important role in Mao's thought or the Communist Party's thought outside of the fact that it was just critical of Confucianism, or were there other substantive aspects that had an impact on policymaking? And then on the other side, for the ROC, was this celebration of Confucianism just a reaction to saying, hey, we are opposite of mainland China? Was it just a political representation in that sense, or did Confucianism actually factor into policymaking or political thought in Taiwan?
Yes, I would say that yes, they did have an influence, but I also don't want to give it too much influence, because the modern ideologies of communism and nationalism and republicanism were still much, the guiding forces. But these parties wanted to find things from their histories that they could kind of connect themselves with. And as far as the communists with legalism, I mean, we can actually go back. One of the very first pieces of writing from Mao that we have is when he was in middle school. He wrote an essay about the legalist philosopher Shangyang, and he calls him, he talks about him very praisingly, like he's a great reformer and a great official. And the things that they applauded the legalists for were the sort of the centralizing bureaucratic reforms and the emphasis on law applying to everyone in society, because they thought, okay, this would be progressive in the march of history, because it would move us out of having feudalism and aristocrats, because if everyone is equal under the law, then your title as an aristocrat doesn't matter. And so that's like progressive in the Marxist historical materialism theory sense. But uh, as far as policy, I mean, I can't really see any example where the Communist Party was like, okay, because the legalists did this, we should do this. Um, but they were certainly happy to use it symbolically, and also it happened. It just coincidentally happened to be the case that during the Criticize Confucius campaign, the tomb of the first emperor, the legalist emperor, was happened to be discovered, and so people in China were really getting interested in their kind of ancient roots because there were all these archaeological discoveries being made in the 70s. So it's kind of culturally, symbolically significant. And in the long term, long array of Chinese history, it is really significant that they would look positively on the first emperor and on legalism, because before that, all of the historiography of it was that this emperor was this dynasty was immoral, and so you wouldn't find praise before the 20th century for the first emperor of China, whereas now he's kind of like part of the story of the national story of like the history of China. He's just like an indispensable part of the unification of China, and so I think it's more of a kind of the symbolic cultural meaning of it. As far as Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek also had a personal kind of interest in Confucianism throughout his life. He was particularly fond of Mencius and the Ming Dynasty Confucian philosopher Wang Yangming. In particular, he thought that Confucianism was very good for giving people a sense of honor and duty and righteousness and loyalty, and that he wanted to use those kinds of traditional values to bolster support for his modernizing regime and the whole military ethos of martial law era Taiwan. So he thought those two could go together. I once heard a good line was that when Chinese rulers want to institute great reforms, they talk about legalism, but when they want to pacify the population, they talk about Confucianism. And so I think that might be true.
And just my last question, if someone is listening to this podcast and they have an interest in the historiography of China or the PRC or the ROC, are there one or two books that you would recommend that someone can go pick up and read?
Sure. Regarding Taiwan or the ROC, I think that the best book that has come out in recent years about kind of the ideology of the ROC during martial law in Taiwan would be a book called Place, Identity, and National Imagination in Post-War Taiwan by Zhang Biyu. And as far as the mainland, well, the last monograph about Piding Picong came out in the 80s, so it's been a while. But there's lots of really great stuff about intellectual history in mainland China. Timothy Cheek's book, The Intellectual and Modern Chinese History, is a great place to look. Another good one would be a scholar, Li Yuning, who in the 70s did some research on this. She wrote a book called Xiangyang's Reforms and State Control in China. And that book is kind of about how modern Chinese intellectuals started thinking about legalism. I think those would be the starting points if anybody were interested in these two campaigns and the way I'm looking at them.
Great, Patrick. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
And for anyone who has an interest in looking at more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you next time.